Welcome back to the channel. And today we're diving deep into one of the most powerful principles that has shaped the lives of billionaires, world leaders, and anyone who has ever achieved extraordinary success. This principle comes from Sun Tzu's ancient masterpiece, The Art of War, and it's this: if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be in danger. Now, before you think this is just about military strategy, let me tell you something that will completely change how you see the world around you. This principle isn't just about warfare, it's about life itself. Every single day, you're fighting battles. You're fighting for your career advancement, for financial freedom, for better relationships, for your dreams and goals. And the people who understand this principle are the ones who consistently win, while everyone else keeps wondering why they're stuck in the same place year after year. Let's start with the first part of Sun Tzu's wisdom, knowing your enemy. In the context of your life, your enemies aren't necessarily people who actively wish you harm. Your enemies are the obstacles, the competition, the systems, and yes, sometimes the people who stand between you and your goals. The moment you understand this, you'll start seeing the world through the lens of a strategist rather than a victim of circumstances. Think about Jeff Bezos when he was building Amazon. He didn't just focus on creating a great bookstore. He studied his enemies, traditional bookstores, other online retailers, and even future competitors who didn't exist yet. He analyzed their weaknesses, their blind spots, their operational inefficiencies. Barnes & Noble was comfortable with their physical stores and slow to adapt to online sales. Traditional publishers were stuck in old distribution models. Bezos saw these weaknesses and built Amazon to exploit every single one of them. He knew that traditional retailers would be slow to respond to online threats, so he moved fast and captured market share before they could react. But here's what most people miss: Bezos also knew himself. He understood his own strengths in technology and logistics, his weaknesses in traditional retail experience, and his resources and limitations as a startup. This self-knowledge allowed him to play to his strengths while avoiding battles he couldn't win. He didn't try to compete with bookstores on the experience of browsing physical books. Instead, he competed on selection, convenience, and price, areas where online retail had natural advantages. Let's look at another example that will show you how this principle works in a completely different context. Oprah Winfrey didn't become the media mogul she is today by accident. When she was building her career, she studied the landscape of television talk shows. She analyzed what Phil Donahue was doing, what other hosts were doing, and most importantly, what they weren't doing. She identified that most talk shows were either too sensational or too intellectual, leaving a gap for someone who could be both authentic and relatable while tackling serious topics. But Oprah's real genius was in knowing herself. She understood that her strength wasn't in being the smartest person in the room or the most polished broadcaster. Her strength was in genuine empathy and the ability to connect with people on an emotional level. She knew that her background, her struggles, and her authenticity were assets, not liabilities. While other hosts tried to maintain distance and professionalism, Oprah embraced vulnerability and connection. She knew her enemy, the cold, impersonal nature of most media, and she knew herself, someone who could bring warmth and authenticity to television. Now, let's talk about how you can apply this principle to transform your own life. The first step is identifying who or what your real enemies are. And this might surprise you. Your biggest enemy might not be your competitor at work or the person who got the promotion you wanted. Your biggest enemy might be your own limiting beliefs, your lack of financial education, your tendency to procrastinate, or your fear of taking risks. Let's say you're trying to advance in your career. Most people focus on doing good work and hoping someone notices. But if you apply Sun Tzu's principle, you would start by studying the landscape. Who makes the promotion decisions? What do they value? What are the unwritten rules of advancement in your organization? What skills do the people above you have that you don't? What political dynamics are at play? This isn't about being manipulative. It's about being strategic and informed. Warren Buffett is a master of this principle in the investment world. He doesn't just pick stocks randomly or follow hot tips. He studies entire industries, understands the competitive landscape, and identifies companies that have sustainable advantages over their competitors. When he invested in Coca-Cola, he wasn't just betting on a beverage company. He studied the entire soft drink industry and realized that Coca-Cola had built something that was nearly impossible for competitors to replicate: global brand recognition and distribution networks that took decades to build. But Buffett also knows himself as an investor. He understands that he's not good at predicting technology trends or investing in businesses he doesn't understand. So he sticks to companies with simple business models that he can analyze thoroughly. He knows his limitations and plays within them, while exploiting his strengths in financial analysis and long-term thinking. Let me share with you how Mark Cuban applied this principle when he was building his first successful business, MicroSolutions. Cuban didn't just start a computer consulting company and hope for the best. He studied the market and realized that most computer consultants were technical experts who couldn't communicate effectively with business owners. His enemies weren't just other consultants. His enemies were the inefficiencies in how technology was being sold and implemented in small businesses. Cuban knew himself. He wasn't the most technical person, but he was excellent at sales and understanding what business owners actually needed. Instead of trying to compete on technical expertise, he competed on service, communication, and results. He positioned himself as the consultant who could translate technical solutions into business benefits. He knew that many business owners were intimidated by technology and frustrated with consultants who spoke in technical jargon, so he became the anti-consultant consultant. This brings us to a crucial point about knowing your enemy in the modern world. Your competition isn't just the person sitting next to you or the company across the street. Your real competition is often someone you've never heard of, working on a solution you haven't thought of, in a place you've never been. The taxi industry didn't see Uber coming because they were focused on competing with other taxi companies. Blockbuster didn't see Netflix coming because they were focused on competing with other video rental stores. So how do you protect yourself from being blindsided? You have to think beyond your immediate competition and ask yourself, what could make what we're doing irrelevant? What technology, social trend, or business model could completely change the game? The people who consistently stay ahead are the ones who are paranoid about disruption and constantly scanning the horizon for threats and opportunities. Let's talk about how to know yourself, because this is where most people fail. Knowing yourself isn't just about understanding your strengths and weaknesses, though that's important. It's about understanding your psychology, your patterns, your blind spots, and your true motivations. Most people lie to themselves about what they really want and what they're really capable of. Elon Musk is someone who has applied this principle of self-knowledge in extraordinary ways. He understands that his strength isn't in being the best engineer or the best businessman in traditional terms. His strength is in seeing possibilities that others can't see and being willing to bet everything on those possibilities. He knows that he's not good at managing day-to-day operations, so he surrounds himself with people who excel at execution. He knows that he tends to be overly optimistic about timelines, so he's learned to factor that into his planning. But Musk also understands his psychological makeup. He knows that he's motivated by big, seemingly impossible challenges rather than incremental improvements. This self-knowledge has guided his choice of industries: space exploration, electric vehicles, neural interfaces, areas where the potential for revolutionary change is enormous, even if the probability of success is low. Here's something that most people don't realize about knowing your enemy and knowing yourself. It's not a one-time exercise. The landscape is constantly changing. Your competitors are evolving, new threats are emerging, and you're growing and changing too. The most successful people make this analysis a regular practice, not a one-time event. Reed Hastings of Netflix is a perfect example of this continuous strategic thinking. When Netflix was a DVD by mail service, Hastings was already thinking about what would eventually kill that business model. He knew that streaming technology would improve, internet speeds would increase, and consumer preferences would shift toward instant gratification. Instead of trying to protect the DVD business, he cannibalized it with streaming before someone else could. But here's the part that really demonstrates strategic thinking. Hastings also knew that Netflix's advantage in streaming wouldn't last forever. He understood that once the technology became commoditized, content would become the differentiator. So while competitors were still figuring out streaming, Netflix was already investing billions in original content. They were fighting tomorrow's war while everyone else was still fighting yesterday's war. Now, let's get practical about how you can apply this in your own life, regardless of your current situation. Start by doing what the military calls intelligence gathering. Study the people who have achieved what you want to achieve. Don't just look at their successes. Look at their failures, their strategies, their decisions, and their timing. What advantages did they have? What obstacles did they overcome? What mistakes did they make that you can avoid? If you're building a business, study not just your direct competitors, but companies in adjacent industries that serve similar customer needs. If you're advancing in your career, study not just the people in your department, but successful people in other departments and other companies. Look for patterns, strategies, and insights that you can adapt to your situation. But equally important is the work of knowing yourself. This requires brutal honesty about your strengths, weaknesses, resources, and limitations. Most people overestimate their strengths and underestimate their weaknesses, which leads to poor strategic decisions. The most successful people have a realistic assessment of their capabilities and make decisions based on that reality, not on wishful thinking. Let me tell you about how this principle applies to personal relationships and social dynamics, because this is an area where most people are completely blind. The people who are most successful in building networks, getting opportunities, and creating influence understand the social landscape they're operating in. They understand who has power, how decisions really get made, what people's motivations are, and how to position themselves advantageously. This doesn't mean being manipulative or dishonest. It means being strategic and informed. When someone like Richard Branson walks into a room, he's not just being charming for the sake of it. He understands that business is fundamentally about relationships, and he studied how to build the kinds of relationships that create opportunities. He knows that most business people are too focused on transactions and not enough on genuine connection. So he's built his entire approach around being authentically interested in people while maintaining clear business objectives. The principle of knowing your enemy also applies to personal obstacles and challenges. Let's say you're trying to lose weight or get in shape. Most people approach this by just trying harder or finding a new diet. But if you apply Sun Tzu's principle, you would start by studying your own patterns and triggers. What causes you to overeat? What situations undermine your willpower? What time of day are you most likely to make poor choices? What emotions drive destructive behaviors? Your enemy in this case isn't food or laziness. Your enemy is the specific psychological and environmental factors that lead to poor decisions. Once you understand these patterns, you can design your environment and your routines to minimize temptation and maximize success. This is why people like Tim Cook wake up at 3:45 a.m. to work out, not because they're naturally more disciplined, but because they've studied their own psychology and know that willpower decreases throughout the day. Let's talk about money and wealth building, because this is an area where understanding enemies and understanding yourself is absolutely critical. Most people fail financially not because they don't earn enough money, but because they don't understand the forces working against them. Your enemies in wealth building are inflation, taxes, lifestyle inflation, marketing designed to make you spend, social pressure to display status, and your own psychological biases around money. The wealthy understand these enemies and structure their finances to minimize their impact. They know that the tax code is written to favor business owners and investors over employees, so they structure their income accordingly. They know that inflation erodes the value of cash over time, so they hold appreciating assets. They know that lifestyle inflation destroys wealth accumulation, so they maintain discipline around spending even as their income grows. But they also know themselves. They understand their own relationship with money, their risk tolerance, their knowledge limitations, and their emotional triggers around financial decisions. Someone like Ray Dalio built one of the world's most successful hedge funds not just by understanding markets, but by understanding his own psychology as an investor and building systems to counteract his biases. Here's where most people go wrong when they try to apply these principles. They focus too much on the external analysis and not enough on the internal work. Knowing your enemy is important, but knowing yourself is what allows you to act effectively on that knowledge. If you don't understand your own motivations, fears, and patterns, you'll make poor decisions even with perfect information about your competition. Let me share something that might change how you think about obstacles and setbacks. Every successful person has faced what seemed like insurmountable challenges. The difference isn't that they were naturally more talented or lucky. The difference is how they analyzed and responded to those challenges. When Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple, he could have seen it as a devastating defeat. Instead, he analyzed what had gone wrong, what he had learned, and how he could apply those lessons going forward. He started Next and bought Pixar not as consolation prizes, but as strategic moves that would eventually position him to return to Apple stronger than ever. He understood that his enemy wasn't just the Apple board that had ousted him. His enemy was his own limitations as a leader and manager that had contributed to the situation. The time away from Apple allowed Jobs to develop skills in areas where he had been weak, to gain experience in different industries, and to build relationships that would serve him later. When he returned to Apple, he wasn't the same person who had left. He had done the work of knowing himself more deeply and had expanded his capabilities as a leader. This is why setbacks can actually be advantages if you know how to use them. They force you to confront realities about yourself and your situation that you might otherwise ignore. They provide information about your enemies, both external and internal, that success often obscures. Think about how this applies to your current situation. What challenges are you facing right now? Instead of just trying to power through them or hoping they'll go away, what can they teach you about the landscape you're operating in and about yourself? What patterns do you notice in your setbacks? What blind spots do they reveal? What capabilities do you need to develop? The most successful people treat every experience as intelligence gathering. They're constantly updating their understanding of themselves and their environment based on new information. They don't just react to events, they extract lessons and insights that inform future decisions. Now, let's talk about timing, because this is a crucial element that most people overlook. Sun Tzu emphasized that knowing your enemy and knowing yourself is not enough. You also need to understand timing and positioning. The same strategy that works brilliantly in one context can fail completely in another context. Mark Zuckerberg didn't succeed with Facebook just because he built a better social network. He succeeded because he understood the timing of internet adoption, the psychology of college students, and the competitive landscape of social media. When he launched Facebook, MySpace was dominant, but Zuckerberg analyzed MySpace's weaknesses, cluttered design, lack of exclusivity, poor user experience, and positioned Facebook as the anti-MySpace. But timing was crucial. If Facebook had launched 5 years earlier, internet adoption wouldn't have been sufficient to reach critical mass. If it had launched 2 years later, someone else might have already captured the market. Zuckerberg understood that there was a window of opportunity, and he had the resources and capabilities to capitalize on it. This is why successful people are constantly monitoring trends, technologies, and social changes. They're not just looking for opportunities, they're looking for the intersection of opportunity, capability, and timing. They understand that the best strategy at the wrong time is still a failure. Let me tell you about how this principle applies to career advancement, because this is something that affects everyone. Most people approach their careers reactively. They do good work and hope someone notices, or they apply for promotions when they become available. But if you apply Sun Tzu's principle, you become proactive and strategic. First, you study the organizational landscape. Who makes decisions about promotions and advancement? What do they value? What are the unwritten rules about how people advance? What skills and experiences do the people above you have in common? What changes are happening in your industry that might create new opportunities or threats? Then you study yourself honestly. What are your actual strengths and weaknesses, not what you wish they were? What unique value do you bring? What are your limitations and blind spots? What do you need to develop to be competitive for the opportunities you want? But here's the key. You also need to position yourself strategically. This might mean volunteering for projects that give you visibility with decision makers, developing skills that are becoming more valuable, or building relationships with people who can influence your advancement. It's not about politics or manipulation. It's about being intentional and strategic about your career development. Someone like Sheryl Sandberg exemplifies this strategic approach. She didn't accidentally become the COO of Facebook. She systematically built capabilities in technology, operations, and leadership through her roles at Google and the Treasury Department. She understood that the technology industry valued both technical understanding and business acumen, so she developed both. When the opportunity at Facebook arose, she was positioned perfectly because she had anticipated what kinds of skills and experience would be valuable. Let's talk about how this principle applies to entrepreneurship and business building. Most entrepreneurs fail not because their products are bad, but because they don't understand the competitive landscape or their own capabilities. They build what they think the market needs without actually studying what the market wants, or they try to compete in areas where they're disadvantaged. The entrepreneurs who succeed are the ones who do their homework. They study successful companies in their space and adjacent spaces. They analyze what worked, what didn't work, and why. They identify gaps in the market that they're uniquely positioned to fill. They understand their own strengths and limitations and build businesses that leverage their advantages while minimizing their disadvantages. Gary Vaynerchuk transformed his family's wine business not by becoming a better wine merchant, but by understanding that the wine industry was stuck in old marketing models. His enemies weren't other wine stores. His enemies were the pretentious, intimidating culture of wine buying and the traditional marketing approaches that most wineries used. He positioned himself as the anti-sommelier, making wine accessible and fun through video content and social media. But Vaynerchuk also knew himself. He understood that his strength wasn't in wine expertise. His strength was in communication and marketing. Instead of trying to compete with traditional wine experts on their terms, he created new terms for competition. He built Wine Library TV not because he was the most knowledgeable wine person, but because he was the most engaging wine person. Here's something crucial that most people miss. Your competitive advantage often comes not from being the best at one thing, but from being uniquely good at a combination of things. Steve Jobs wasn't the best technologist, or the best designer, or the best marketer, but he was uniquely good at the intersection of technology, design, and marketing. That combination was his competitive advantage. This is why knowing yourself is so important. You need to understand not just your individual strengths, but how your strengths combine in ways that create unique value. Maybe you're not the best programmer, but you're a good programmer who also understands business strategy. Maybe you're not the best salesperson, but you're a good salesperson who also understands data analysis. These combinations often create more defensible competitive advantages than excellence in a single area. Let's talk about how this applies to personal relationships and social influence. The people who are most effective at building relationships and influencing others understand the social dynamics they're operating in. They study what motivates people, what people's insecurities and desires are, and how social groups function. This isn't about being manipulative. It's about being effective. When someone like Oprah interviews people, she's not just asking random questions. She's studied her guests, she understands what they want to communicate, and she knows how to create an environment where they feel comfortable sharing authentically. She's also studied her audience and knows what kinds of conversations will resonate with them. But Oprah also knows herself as an interviewer. She understands that her strength is empathy and emotional intelligence, not confrontational journalism. She's positioned herself in the space between hard news and entertainment, where her natural abilities are most effective. She doesn't try to be Barbara Walters or Anderson Cooper. She's developed her own approach based on her own strengths. Now, I want to talk about something that's crucial in today's world, the importance of continuous learning and adaptation. The landscape is changing faster than ever before. Technologies that didn't exist 5 years ago are now transforming entire industries. Social media has changed how reputation and influence work. Globalization has changed how businesses compete. The people who succeed in this environment are the ones who treat learning as a continuous process, not a phase of life that ends with formal education. They're constantly updating their understanding of their competitive landscape and their own capabilities. They're experimenting, testing, and adapting their strategies based on new information. Someone like Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, exemplifies this approach. He didn't just build LinkedIn and then coast on that success. He's constantly analyzing trends in technology, social behavior, and business models. He's an active investor and advisor to other companies because it gives him intelligence about emerging opportunities and threats. He understands that his success depends on staying ahead of changes in his industry. This continuous learning approach applies to every aspect of life. If you're in sales, you need to understand how buyer behavior is changing, what new tools and technologies are available, and how your competition is evolving. If you're in marketing, you need to understand new platforms, changing consumer preferences, and emerging communication channels. But you also need to be constantly learning about yourself. Your strengths and weaknesses change as you gain experience. Your interests and motivations evolve. Your life circumstances shift. The strategies that worked for you 5 years ago might not work today, not because they were wrong then, but because the context has changed. Let me share something about resilience and how it relates to this principle. The people who achieve long-term success aren't necessarily the ones who never fail. They're the ones who learn from failure and use it to become stronger. But this requires both knowing your enemies and knowing yourself at a deeper level. When someone like Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team, he could have interpreted that as evidence that he wasn't good enough. Instead, he analyzed what he needed to improve and what advantages he could develop. He understood that his enemies weren't just other players. His enemies were his own limitations in skill, strength, and mental toughness. He used that setback as information about what he needed to work on. But Jordan also knew himself. He understood that he was motivated by challenges and competition, not by easy success. He learned to use criticism and setbacks as fuel rather than discouragement. This self-knowledge allowed him to turn obstacles into advantages throughout his career. This is a crucial point. Your relationship with obstacles and setbacks often determines your long-term success more than your natural talents. The people who treat challenges as information and opportunities for growth have a huge advantage over people who treat them as evidence of their limitations. Let's talk about financial intelligence and how it relates to this principle. Most people fail financially not because they don't earn enough money, but because they don't understand the forces working against them, and they don't understand their own psychology around money. Your financial enemies include inflation, which erodes the purchasing power of your savings over time. They include taxes, which take a significant portion of your income if you don't structure your finances strategically. They include lifestyle inflation, where your spending increases as fast as your income, preventing wealth accumulation. They include marketing and social pressure designed to make you spend money on things that don't build wealth. But your biggest financial enemy is often your own psychology. Most people make emotional decisions about money rather than strategic ones. They buy things to feel better or to impress others. They avoid investing because they're afraid of losing money, not understanding that not investing guarantees losing money to inflation over time. The wealthy understand these enemies and structure their financial lives accordingly. They automate their savings and investments so that emotions don't interfere with wealth building. They focus on assets that appreciate over time rather than liabilities that depreciate. They understand tax strategy and structure their income to minimize tax burden legally. But they also know themselves. They understand their own risk tolerance, their knowledge limitations, and their emotional triggers around money. Someone like Warren Buffett has succeeded as an investor not just because he understands businesses and markets, but because he understands his own psychology and has developed systems to make good decisions consistently over time. Here's something that might surprise you about competition and how successful people think about it. The most successful people often don't try to beat their competition directly. They try to make their competition irrelevant. They create new categories, change the rules of the game, or find ways to compete where their natural advantages are most pronounced. When Southwest Airlines entered the airline industry, they didn't try to compete with major airlines on their terms: luxury service, hub-and-spoke routing, first-class amenities. Instead, they created a new category of air travel focused on low cost, convenience, and simplicity. They made traditional airline advantages irrelevant by changing what customers valued most. This is a crucial strategic insight. Sometimes the best way to deal with a stronger enemy is not to fight them directly, but to change the battlefield. If you can't win on their terms, create new terms where your advantages matter more than theirs. This applies to career advancement too. If you can't compete with your colleagues on traditional metrics like seniority or connections, maybe you can create value in new areas like digital skills, cross-functional collaboration, or understanding emerging trends. The goal is to position yourself where your natural strengths are most valuable and your weaknesses matter least. Let me talk about something that's often overlooked: the importance of building systems and habits rather than relying on motivation and willpower. The most successful people understand that their biggest enemy is often their own inconsistency. They know that motivation comes and goes, but systems and habits compound over time to create extraordinary results. Someone like James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits, understands that most people fail not because they don't know what to do, but because they don't consistently do what they know. He studied the psychology of behavior change and developed systems for making good habits automatic and bad habits difficult. This is another application of knowing yourself, understanding your own patterns of behavior and designing your environment to support your goals rather than undermine them. If you know you're likely to skip workouts when you're tired, you schedule workouts for when your energy is highest. If you know you spend too much money when you shop hungry, you eat before you go shopping. The key insight is that success is less about heroic effort and more about intelligent design of your habits and environment. When you understand your own psychology and design your life accordingly, success becomes more automatic and less dependent on daily decisions. Now, let's talk about networking and relationship building, because this is where understanding people's motivations and interests becomes crucial. The most effective networkers aren't just friendly and outgoing. They're strategic about understanding what other people want and need, and they position themselves to provide value. Someone like Keith Ferrazzi, who wrote Never Eat Alone, understands that effective networking isn't about collecting business cards or asking for favors. It's about understanding what problems people are trying to solve and what goals they're trying to achieve, then finding ways to help them succeed. He studies the people he wants to connect with, understands their challenges and opportunities, and approaches relationships from a position of giving value rather than seeking it. But he also knows himself. He understands his own strengths in connecting people and ideas, and he's built his career around leveraging those strengths. He doesn't try to be the smartest person in the room. He tries to be the most connected and most helpful person in the room. This approach to relationships applies beyond professional networking. The people who build strong personal relationships understand what their friends and family members value, what challenges they're facing, and how to be genuinely supportive. They're not trying to manipulate. They're trying to understand and connect. Let's discuss how this principle applies to leadership and influence. The most effective leaders aren't necessarily the smartest or most charismatic. They're the ones who understand the people they're leading and who understand their own leadership style and capabilities. Someone like Satya Nadella transformed Microsoft's culture not by trying to be like Steve Jobs or other famous CEOs, but by understanding what Microsoft needed and what his own strengths were as a leader. He analyzed Microsoft's enemies, both external competitors and internal cultural problems, and positioned himself to address those challenges effectively. Nadella understood that Microsoft's biggest enemy wasn't Google or Apple. It was their own internal culture of competition and know-it-all attitudes that was preventing collaboration and innovation. He also knew himself. He understood that his strength was in empathy and collaboration, not in being the smartest person in the room. He leveraged those strengths to transform Microsoft's culture and business results. Effective leadership requires understanding what motivates different people and adapting your approach accordingly. Some people are motivated by recognition, others by autonomy, others by learning opportunities. The best leaders study their team members and customize their leadership approach to each person's needs and motivations. Let's discuss how this principle applies to leadership and influence. The most effective leaders aren't necessarily the smartest or most charismatic. They're the ones who understand the people they're leading and who understand their own leadership style and capabilities. Someone like Satya Nadella transformed Microsoft's culture not by trying to be like Steve Jobs or other famous CEOs, but by understanding what Microsoft needed and what his own strengths were as a leader. He analyzed Microsoft's enemies, both external competitors and internal cultural problems, and positioned himself to address those challenges effectively. Nadella understood that Microsoft's biggest enemy wasn't Google or Apple. It was their own internal culture of competition and know-it-all attitudes that was preventing collaboration and innovation. He also knew himself. He understood that his strength was in empathy and collaboration, not in being the smartest person in the room. He leveraged those strengths to transform Microsoft's culture and business results. Effective leadership requires understanding what motivates different people and adapting your approach accordingly. Some people are motivated by recognition, others by autonomy, others by learning opportunities. The best leaders study their team members and customize their leadership approach to each person's needs and motivations. This patience and long-term thinking applies to personal development too. The people who achieve extraordinary results often spend years building capabilities and positioning themselves before they see dramatic external success. They understand that real advantages take time to develop and that the most sustainable success comes from deep preparation rather than quick tactics. Let me share something about innovation and creativity that relates to this principle. The most innovative people aren't necessarily the most creative in a traditional sense. They're the ones who understand existing solutions and their limitations, then find new ways to solve old problems. Someone like Elon Musk didn't invent electric cars or rockets or solar panels, but he studied existing approaches in these industries and identified fundamental limitations and inefficiencies. In the auto industry, he saw that electric cars were positioned as compromises, less performance, less convenience, less style than gas cars. He made electric cars that were superior to gas cars in performance and technology, changing the entire category. But Musk also knows himself as an innovator. He understands that his strength is in seeing possibilities that others miss and being willing to bet everything on those possibilities. He's not the best engineer or the best businessman in traditional terms, but he's uniquely good at identifying breakthrough opportunities and mobilizing resources to pursue them. This approach to innovation applies to smaller-scale creativity too. The people who come up with breakthrough solutions in their jobs or personal lives often aren't just brainstorming randomly. They're studying existing approaches, understanding why they're limited, and finding new ways to solve old problems. Now, let's talk about adaptation and evolution, because the most successful people understand that static strategies eventually fail. They're constantly monitoring changes in their environment and adjusting their approach accordingly. Reed Hastings at Netflix exemplifies this adaptive approach. He built Netflix as a DVD by mail service, but he was already planning for streaming before most people had broadband internet. When streaming became viable, he cannibalized his own DVD business to build the streaming business. When streaming became commoditized, he shifted focus to original content. Each transition required understanding new enemies and new opportunities while staying true to his core strengths as a leader. This adaptability requires both external awareness and self-awareness. You need to understand how your environment is changing, but you also need to understand how you're changing. Your interests, capabilities, and circumstances evolve over time. The strategies that worked for you in your 20s might not work in your 40s, not because they were wrong, but because you're different and the world is different. The most successful people treat their careers and their lives as ongoing experiments. They're constantly testing new approaches, learning from the results, and updating their strategies. They don't get attached to particular tactics or methods. They stay focused on their goals while remaining flexible about how to achieve them. Here's something about persistence and when to pivot that relates to this principle. Many people think that success requires never giving up, but actually, success often requires knowing when to change course. The key is understanding whether you're facing a temporary obstacle or a fundamental limitation. Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple in 1985, and he could have spent years trying to get back in immediately. Instead, he used that time to build Next and Pixar, which gave him new capabilities and perspectives that made him a more effective leader when he returned to Apple 12 years later. He understood that sometimes the best way to achieve your ultimate goal is to pursue intermediate goals that build your capabilities. This requires honest self-assessment about whether your current approach is working and whether the obstacles you're facing are temporary or permanent. Sometimes persistence is exactly what you need. Sometimes pivoting is what you need. The key is having enough self-awareness and environmental awareness to make the right choice. Let me talk about something that's often overlooked: the importance of understanding systems and incentives rather than just individual competitors. Your real enemies are often not people but systems, structures, and incentive patterns that work against your goals. If you're trying to eat healthily, your enemy isn't just your own willpower. Your enemy is a food system designed to make processed foods more convenient and cheaper than healthy foods. If you're trying to save money, your enemy isn't just your own spending habits. Your enemy is a marketing system designed to create desire for things you don't need and a financial system that makes borrowing easier than saving. The people who succeed understand these systemic forces and design their lives to work with positive systems and against negative ones. They don't just rely on willpower. They change their environment to make good choices easier and bad choices harder. Warren Buffett succeeds as an investor partly because he understands the incentive systems that drive corporate behavior. He invests in companies where management's incentives are aligned with shareholder interests, and he avoids companies where those incentives are misaligned. He doesn't just analyze what companies say they'll do. He analyzes what they're incentivized to do. This system's thinking applies to personal relationships too. The healthiest relationships are ones where both people's needs and incentives are aligned, where supporting each other's success benefits everyone involved. The most problematic relationships are ones where people's incentives are in conflict, where one person's success requires another. If you apply all these formula into your life, you can transform your life. And subscribe if you want more of this kind of life-changing content. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.